In a city where the past never quite stays buried, a quiet knock, a whispered confession, and a vanished voice from 1944 set the wheels of justice turning, slowly and with no promise of peace. Behind locked doors and polished wine glasses, truth becomes currency and memory, a weapon. You're about to enter a world where guilt lingers like perfume, and not every silence is innocent. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. When I returned to the brownstone that morning, clutching 2 cups of coffee and a box of pastries I had no intention of sharing, I could already smell the tension drifting out of the front room like an undercooked omelette. The smell of coffee usually calmed Wolfe, like a sea breeze to a narwhal, but not today. He was seated, or rather ensconced, in his oversized chair with the immovability of a lighthouse. Fritz stood by the archway wiping his hands on a cloth napkin that had once been starched into military shape. Wolfe's lips were drawn into the line that meant someone had insulted either his palate or his intellect, possibly both. "He used escarole," Wolfe announced, without so much as a glance in my direction. "In the cassoulet." "I presume we're speaking of Fritz," I said, taking a seat. "And not an ancient Roman senator." Fritz winced. "Mr. Wolfe, we were out of Belgian endive. The grocer sent escarole as substitute." "A cook improvises, a chef plans," Wolfe growled. "And a palate remembers." I passed him his coffee. "If the endive shortage is our gravest concern this morning, we may count ourselves lucky." That, of course, is when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a black-and-white photograph, one of those glossy war-era portraits where the smoke curled and the secrets clung to the corners. She was tall, raven-haired, and overdressed for the weather, which meant she had something to hide, or something to say. "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe," she said, her accent brushing against the words like wind through silk. French, but polished, like someone who had once been poor and had since been taught not to show it. I gave her the patented Goodwin smile, the one that makes nervous visitors stay nervous. "He doesn't see visitors without appointment, and definitely not before beer." She reached into her handbag and produced a small, battered envelope. "He will want to see this. I've seen enough drama queens and desperate heirs to know when someone is bluffing." She wasn't. "Name? Elodie Varin." She said it like it had once meant something. Maybe it still did. I led her to the office. Wolfe did not rise. He didn't even look up until she said, "I'm here because someone has written to me about Paris." That got him. Barely, but it got him. She laid the envelope on Wolfe's desk like a truce offering. It was crumpled, the kind of crumple that didn't come from careless fingers, but from hesitation, a hand squeezing paper too tightly before deciding to share it. Wolfe gave me a look that said, "Do the honors," and I slid the page free. One sentence, typed, no signature, no heading. "You know what was said that night in Paris. Stay silent." Wolfe's eyes flicked upward. "Is this a threat, madam, or a poorly staged overture?" Elodie didn't blink. "I don't know, that's why I came." Wolfe snorted softly. "If I responded to every anonymous note referencing a European city and a vague insinuation, I'd have no time for orchids." Which, in Wolfe speak, was still more interested than he usually let on. I held on to the page, just in case. Wolfe adjusted his bulk in the chair, as if preparing to endure an opera he hadn't paid for. "You will explain," he said. Elodie's fingers danced across the edge of her handbag. "My husband, Claude, was stationed in Paris in 1944. Resistance work. After the liberation, we celebrated. Wine flowed. He drank too much." "And in vino veritas," Wolfe murmured. She nodded, eyes fixed on a point behind Wolfe's head. "That night, he told me something terrible, a thing he claimed to have done. He cried afterward, but in the morning, he remembered nothing." "What precisely did he say?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It was muddled, There was a name, I think it began with M, and he said, I didn't have a choice. Wolfe's brows climbed half an inch. And you've carried this for how many years? Long enough, she said. But until now, no one else knew. That, Wolfe said with faint disdain, is the sort of belief cultivated by those who think silence is a vault. It is not. I am not a confessor, madam, Wolfe said, leaning back. I am a detective. The distinction lies in my interest, truth, not relief. Elodie's composure flickered, but only for a breath. You may wish me to exhume your husband's sins, dust them off, and tell you they were forgivable. But I do not deal in absolution. I glanced at her. She hadn't come for forgiveness. She'd come for protection, but she didn't know from whom. I'm not asking for comfort, she said quietly. I'm asking for help. Wolfe sighed. There is nothing actionable in what you've said, only the smoke of an old fire, and I do not chase ghosts, Miss Varin, not without proof they're still burning. She rose, spine straight. Then thank you for your time. Wolfe didn't respond, which from him was as good as a door closing. She was almost at the door when it happened. Her handbag slipped slightly as she reached for her coat, and a second envelope, thinner and sealed, fell to the carpet like a feather with bad intentions. I picked it up. She didn't notice. Wolfe did. Miss Varin, he said, have you misplaced something? She turned, saw it in my hand, and flushed. No, that wasn't meant. She stopped herself. You may keep it. That was interesting. People rarely gift sealed letters to detectives without strings attached. She left without another word. Wolfe gave me the barest tilt of the head. I opened the letter with a delicacy I usually reserve for expensive cigars and divorce decrees typed, again, same machine. If you don't forget Paris, there will be another death. I looked at Wolfe. Still smoke? His eyes didn't move from the orchid on the corner table. It smoulders, he said. I placed the letter in front of Wolfe. He didn't touch it. Instead, he studied it as though it were an insect on a leaf, possibly venomous, certainly uninvited. Same ribbon depth, same alignment issues, I offered. Same machine, I'd bet. Wolfe nodded once, barely perceptible. This is no longer indulgent reminiscence. No, I said, it's a preview. Wolfe finally leaned forward and read the line again, lips unmoving. His jaw tightened, just enough to register to anyone who knew what that meant, which at the moment was only me. Someone, he said at last, believes Paris is not in the past, and is willing to kill for that belief. He didn't say we were taking the case. He didn't have to. That night, around 10, I was at my desk going over old notes when the radio popped in with a news bulletin. The police have identified the victim as Hubert Merivale, prominent art critic and European émigré. He was found in his Gramercy Park apartment, deceased, with a message written in blood at the scene. Authorities confirm the phrase read, "Forgive me, Elodie." I looked at Wolfe. He didn't blink. "Merivale?" I said. "Ring a bell?" He nodded. He was in Paris during the occupation, a cultural attaché of sorts, moved in high circles and low ones. Friend of the Varins? Perhaps, or something else. The line in blood kept ringing in my head like a cracked church bell. I closed the notebook. So we've got a typed warning, a murdered art critic, and a woman with a memory she doesn't want to believe in. Wolfe stirred, finally. We have something more potent than that, Archie. What's that? He lifted his eyes. A secret that is no longer willing to stay secret. And with that, the case had stopped knocking. It had walked in and taken a seat. The morning began with bacon and ended with a bulldozer in a wrinkled suit. I had just settled in with Fritz's latest contribution to American breakfast culture when the bell rang with a vengeance. 2 minutes later, Inspector Kramer stood in the office like a thunderhead waiting to be struck. He didn't sit. He didn't ask. He didn't even say hello. Instead, he fished into his inner coat pocket and flung a glossy 8x10 onto Wolfe's blotter like a poker chip he didn't want back. I suppose this doesn't ring any bells? Wolfe, who had been eyeing a catalogue of rare orchids with the detached lust of a medieval monk, lifted one brow without lifting his bulk. I have not yet acquired telepathy, Inspector. You knew he was in town. I know many things, but not, alas, what corpse you've seen fit to deliver. Kramer stabbed a finger at the photo. Hubert Merivale, found dead in his apartment last night. Knife wound, blood on the carpet, and a little note, written in the victim's blood. Wolfe sighed, ghastly, but it does not follow that he was stabbed with my approval. Kramer grunted. You're connected to this. I know it. Wolfe inclined his head, the way a man might acknowledge an ant crossing a table. The name, he said. What did your artist scrawl in blood? Kramer crossed his arms. 4 words. Forgive me, Elodie. That landed. Wolfe's eyelids lowered half a notch. High emotion for him. I kept my face steady. Same Elodie we entertained yesterday. Same, Kramer barked. And unless you two develop selective amnesia overnight, I want to know why that woman shows up here talking about Paris and death, and 12 hours later Merivale writes her name with his last ounce of hemoglobin. Wolfe snorted. Inspector, I have no control over the timing of violent crime. You have control over everything that happens behind these walls, Kramer growled. I leaned back, hands folded. For what it's worth, she didn't mention Merivale, or blood, or apologies. No, Wolfe said thoughtfully, but she did mention Paris. And a confession. Kramer turned to me. She's coming in. She'll come, I said. But don't expect her to confess with blood and flair. He glanced again at the photograph. Then I'll settle for the truth, even if I have to scrape it off your carpet. She came just after noon, wearing the same tailored coat and an expression that had grown more brittle since our last meeting. Kramer paced like a terrier with a bone he hadn't decided how to bury. Wolfe didn't greet her. He didn't have to. The weight in the room had already introduced itself. Elodie Varin, Kramer said. When was the last time you saw Hubert Merivale? She didn't flinch. That was interesting. She looked at Kramer with the calmness of a woman who's been accused before and survived it. 3 years ago, at a gallery opening. He commented on the lighting. I never saw him again. He's dead. I know. You know? She folded her hands in her lap. It was in the news. Kramer showed her the photograph. Do you deny he wrote this? I don't know that handwriting. I'm not an expert. Wolfe spoke at last. Madam, are you aware that a note written in blood carries more weight than ink? She turned to him. I am aware that dead men can say anything and be believed. Wolfe's lip curled. Not in this house. She said nothing more. And that silence told me she was hiding something, just not what Kramer thought. Since Wolfe's legs are for balance, not travel, I was dispatched to the Varins' wine office downtown, an operation that combined French sophistication with American bookkeeping. Claude Varin was there, seated behind a mahogany desk, smelling faintly of cedar and something sharper. Guilt, maybe. He rose as I entered, extending a hand with just enough warmth to suggest he preferred cold. Mr. Goodwin, how unexpected. Not if you follow the news, I said, taking a seat without invitation. Merivale's dead. Your name's in the orbit. That makes me expected. Claude smiled. Hubert was a complicated man, critics often are. Complicated enough to write your wife's name in his own blood? That cost him a flicker, which he quickly replaced with charm. If he did that, I can only imagine it was symbolic. He did adore her once. Were they lovers? No. He said it too quickly. Not exactly. That's an interesting category. Claude leaned forward. What is it you think I know, Mr. Goodwin? I stood. Nothing useful, not yet. But you've got the look of a man who rehearses the truth before speaking it. He laughed. And you've got the look of a man who doesn't wait for permission. I didn't. Merivale's studio was on the second floor of a once genteel building just off Gramercy Park, the kind of place where secrets hang like heavy drapes. The crime scene was quiet now, yellow tape sagging at the edges, a patrolman too bored to care. I slipped the badge Kramer hates that I have and made my way up. The blood had been scrubbed in patches, but not entirely. You could still see the ghost of the final message, a vague smear where 4 fatal words had once tried to explain everything. His desk was chaos, paper clippings, half-written essays, a pipe turned on its side like it had fainted mid-thought. In a drawer I found the photograph, aged, curled at the edges but intact enough. A group of 6 smiling before a shutter in wartime Paris. I recognized Merivale, I recognized Irene Foresight, looking impossibly young. Claude Varin stood beside her. One figure had been torn away, not cut, torn. There's a difference in anger. I slipped it into my pocket and kept digging. A wine stain on a carpet, a stray cufflink marked CV, and in the fireplace charred remains of something once square and magnetic, like tape. I didn't yet know what was missing, but I knew this. Someone wanted that photograph incomplete. And Wolfe, when I brought it to him, would know why. Among the debris near Merivale's bed was a theatre programme, folded and fragile. Théâtre Hébertot, Paris, 1943. On the back, in looping script, Avec tendresse, Irene. Irene Foresight again. The actress with the tragic eyes and a smile that had fooled better men. Beneath the programme lay a slim, leather-bound book, Méditations catholiques. Not the sort of thing Merivale had ever been known to quote. The corner was stiff with blood. Inside, a pressed violet, dried and skeletal. On the title page, one penciled line, Psalm 94. They band together against the life of the righteous. I wasn't much for psalms, but it sounded like a hint or a plea. I slipped both items into the envelope with the photograph and zipped the case closed. Wolfe didn't like sentiment, but he liked symbolism, and he liked when books showed up in murder. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe examined the photograph with gloved hands, the way a man might handle a document with both reverence and disdain. He stared at the torn section for nearly 2 minutes without a word. Then he spoke. There were 6. Now 5, I said. 3 we know, 1 dead, 1 vanished. He laid the photo flat. This was not an accident. Whoever removed the 6th figure did so recently. The tear is fresh. The motive is not. I handed him the programme and the prayer book. He sniffed at them as if checking for arsenic. Forsyth again. And this. He opened the prayer book. Religious guilt. A tool more potent than money. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. Someone has removed themselves from history, Archie. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they were. You think the missing face is the killer? I think, he said slowly, that the one who disappears from a photograph is the one who understands how dangerous memory can be. He closed the book with a snap, and they intend to make sure no one remembers at all. There are visits you remember for their content, and others you remember for their setting. My visit to Irene Forsyth's hotel suite fell firmly into the latter. The woman had a gift for ambiance. She opened the door herself, her version of modesty, and swept me into a suite that smelled like jasmine, old perfume, and money beginning to forget itself. She wore a robe, ivory silk with a neckline that needed its own license, and she greeted me with the faint smile of someone who'd once had secrets whispered to her across Paris cafes. "Mr. Goodwin," she purred, "do sit. Champagne?" The bottle was already uncorked, chilling in a silver bucket. Noon, yes, but not by her clock. I declined the flute. She poured 2 anyway. The suite was half light and full of shadows, the drapes pulled against the too honest clarity of early spring. She gestured to a chair across from hers, sat with languid grace, and lifted her glass. "To memory," she said. "Always a risky toast." She laughed, a sound with sharp corners. Then drink to forgetfulness. I didn't. Wolfe wouldn't approve, and more to the point, I wanted all my faculties when the curtain started to rise. Actors, I've learned, rarely recall events, they recall dialogue. Irene was no exception. She leaned back, fingers curled around the stem of her glass, and spoke like a woman delivering a monologue no one had asked for, but she intended to give anyway. It was October, the cellar beneath the Rue Clichy, a place with too many bottles and too few confessions. Paris was still broken then, but she wore her bandages well. I waited. There was a man, she said. He had a voice like sand. He spoke of something done, something dreadful, but done with reason. And? She sipped. I don't know his name. He spoke through the dark. We were not introduced. But you remember the confession? She looked at me over the rim of her glass. I remember the cold, and that someone else was listening. That put a bend in the narrative. I let the silence stretch. Who else? She shrugged, the robe shifting slightly. I couldn't say. It was Paris. Someone was always listening. I made a mental note. Irene liked to speak in riddles, but the kind that bled at the edges. I had no doubt she knew more than she told, and told more than she intended. She refilled her glass, though the bubbles had begun to wilt. Her fingers weren't as steady as before, and the flute sang slightly against the rim of the table. There was a recording, she said softly. It was made on a little reel-to-reel, portable, discreet. The resistance used them. And you had it? I did. For years. Until? Her laugh this time was thinner. Until someone decided I shouldn't. Who? She hesitated, eyes drawn toward the window where the curtains refused to admit daylight. Someone with a past they wished rewritten. Did they take it from you? They bought it, she said. Or I sold it. Depends on the script. I leaned forward. Was it Claude Varin? No. She blinked. Claude was reckless but not cruel. Merivale? She didn't answer. That was an answer. The tremor in her hand grew more pronounced. I had the sense she was balancing on a wire of her own making, one stretched between vanity and fear. You still have a copy? She shook her head. Number only the memory, but that's enough to make me dangerous. And though the words came with theatrical flair, I didn't miss the flicker of real dread behind her eyes. Back at the brownstone, I barely had time to take off my coat before the phone rang. Wolfe answered it himself, a rarity reserved for clients, creditors, and threats that couldn't be ignored. I watched him as the voice came through. He didn't speak for a long time, his lips pressed into a line that would have done justice to a Latin inscription. Finally, he murmured, "That is not advice. It is an attempt at intimidation." A pause. "Number, you may not speak to Mr. Goodwin, and I do not entertain anonymity even in French." He hung up with deliberate finality. I raised an eyebrow. "Friend from the Foreign Legion?" Wolfe grunted. "Someone who wishes to remain a shadow." He said only this, "You are touching what must remain buried." I nodded. "Well, that's friendly." He looked at the phone, then at me. It was not a warning, Archie, it was a forecast. When Wolfe requests Fritz's assistance outside the kitchen, something's off. It happened once during a gas leak and once more when a rare orchid was dying of neglect. This made it the third occasion in 5 years. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "examine the telephone junction." Fritz, to his credit, didn't blink. He nodded, fetched a small toolkit from the pantry, and crouched with the grace of a man who knew both soufflé and solder. 10 minutes later, he stood. "Someone has tampered. There is a junction bypass, wired rudely but effectively. It would permit a listener." Wolfe's face darkened like cloud cover over a lake. "Remove it." As Fritz snipped and sealed, I leaned against the wall. "Someone's very interested in our small Parisian puzzle." "Yes," Wolfe said, "and now they know we are too." I whistled low. "Wiretap, Threats, a missing tape, and a blood signature. We're officially on the radar. No, Wolfe said coldly. We were always on the radar. We have merely confirmed it. He reached for his beer without urgency, but the fingers were taut. It wasn't panic, it was calculation. And when Wolfe calculates, something, or someone, is usually about to become irrelevant. My next stop was a second-hand customs officer who owed me a favor and was trying hard to forget it. I brought him coffee, reminded him of a few shared indiscretions, and left with a file folder heavy on shipping manifests and light on moral clarity. Claude Varin's name appeared in fine ink across a dozen post-war art shipments, paintings from Bordeaux to Boston, sculptures from Marseille to Montreal, all carefully declared, all declared worthless. Hubert Merivale's name was harder to spot, but it was there, penciled into the notes as a consultant, a designation popular among those who never lifted crates, but had much to say about what was inside them. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe glanced through the folder with the kind of distaste usually reserved for cheap Riesling. Forged provenance, he muttered. Art as currency, wine as cover. Creative bookkeeping, I offered. Creative theft, Wolfe corrected. And dangerous only when shared. I waited. He looked up. Merivale and Varin were partners, and perhaps once something worse. You mean collaborators? I mean opportunists. He handed the folder back. And opportunists, Archie, rarely stop with profit. Eventually, they want to erase their accomplices. The news came at 6:47 p.m., courtesy of a bored voice on the radio and a file note from Lon Cohen. Irene Foresight, age 52, found dead in her suite at the Margrave. Cause, overdose. Circumstances unclear. Wolfe closed his eyes for a beat, then reopened them with the precision of a shutter. She was not suicidal, he said. Not according to the housekeeper, I added. The drapes were drawn, radio left on, the champagne had gone flat. He nodded once. It was an exit, not a collapse. Meaning? Someone wrote her ending. I folded the paper in my hand and made sure no one would rewrite it. Wolfe didn't answer. He didn't have to. There are deaths that close chapters and others that rip pages out. This one felt like the latter. That evening, Wolfe sat in silence longer than usual. His gaze was on a slim volume of Racine, unopened, its purpose decorative rather than literary. Finally, he spoke. She was silenced not for what she said, but for what she never dared say aloud. I glanced up. So someone thought she might finally talk. No, Wolfe said. They feared she might remember more clearly, that she might name a name she had buried with the wine and the makeup. And you think she would have? She already had, he said, to herself. But that was enough. I closed the notebook in front of me. So what now? He reached for his beer. Now we listen, because those who kill to keep the past buried rarely stop digging. And with that, the house fell quiet, except for the faint hum of secrets pressing against the walls. It wasn't the blood that caught my eye, it was the pencil. Merivale's prayer book, which Wolfe had passed over with a brief curl of the lip, hadn't exactly screamed clue. But when I flipped through it one more time, a faint scrawl in the margin blinked at me like a code trying to be remembered. It was smudged, probably from the same hand that had left the crimson on the corner, but still legible enough for someone who reads upside down as often as I do. In soft graphite, just above Psalm 94, was a name, Aimard Leclerc, and beneath it, a New York address that had been partly erased, but not well. Wolfe arched a brow when I showed him. Leclerc, he repeated. A French ecclesiastic surname, not common, not theatrical. Could be a priest, or someone pretending to be one. I checked the address against the directory. It wasn't a cathedral or even a chapel, just a parish in the Bronx that hadn't advertised a confession since the Eisenhower administration. Wolfe muttered something about divine irony and sent me off with instructions to observe, not provoke, which coming from him was like asking a match to enter a barn quietly. The church of Saint-Bénigne didn't look like it had many sins left to forgive. It sat sandwiched between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore, its stone steps worn thin and its signage faded to a hue best described as penitential beige. Inside, the air was cool and musty, with the scent of beeswax and resignation. A few scattered heads bowed in prayer, more in habit than hope. I took a pew in the back and waited. He entered from the sacristy, dressed in a cassock that had seen better threads. His gait was measured, his hair silvered, and his features, though aged, matched an old newspaper clipping Wolfe had dug up from the French archives. The nameplate near the altar read, Father Lucien Marcel. But I wasn't here for Lucien Marcel. After the briefest of post-sermon farewells, I approached him near the confessional. "Father Leclerc?" I said quietly. He didn't flinch, just turned and studied me like I was an old question he hadn't expected to hear again. "Not any more," he said. "Still," I replied, "I believe you once heard something in Paris." "Something in the dark." He looked away. "Yes," he said, "and I wish to God I hadn't." We sat in the sacristy, a room with peeling paint and a single photograph of Pius XII that stared down like an indifferent judge. Leclerc folded his hands and stared at them for a long moment before speaking. It was 1944. The Germans were retreating, but not gently. The churches were half sanctuary, half informant. He shifted, as if shaking off a memory. One night, a man entered the booth and began to speak. His voice was quiet, but not broken. He confessed to a killing, a deliberate one. He claimed it was necessary. Did he give a name? Number? And I didn't ask. That's not how confession works. I nodded, though the morality of silence never sat particularly well with me. But he spoke French? Yes, with an accent. Not Parisian, educated, but reserved. And you believed him? Leclerc looked at me then, and there was no priest left in the eyes, just a man who had once been young and frightened. I believe he was telling the truth, and I believe he carried it like a stone in his chest ever since. Outside, a bell rang, flat and tired. He turned toward it. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Goodwin." I didn't argue, but I wasn't done. It was the kind of moment I knew Wolfe would classify as essential, but maddeningly inconclusive. As I stood to leave, I asked one last question. Was he alone? Leclerc stiffened. He looked like a man deciding whether to open a second wound. No. That stopped me. There was someone else in the church. I didn't see them, but I heard breathing. Close. Too close. Could it have been echo? I've heard echo all my life. This was breath, human, deliberate. Listening? Yes, he said. Not praying, listening. He looked up then, and his voice lost its tired rhythm. You must understand what that means. If someone heard a confession, they didn't just hear guilt, they heard leverage, and if they remember, it can be turned into power. Did you report it? To whom? The Germans? The resistance? God? I didn't press. It wasn't cowardice. It was understanding. Outside, the wind pushed against the old church doors like it had something urgent to say. Leclerc glanced at it and muttered, "Some sins belong to nations, Mr. Goodwin. Others to individuals." He crossed himself. I didn't ask if it helped. I stepped out into the cold, and the next shadow was waiting. When I returned, Wolfe was in the plant rooms, coaxing a rare stanhope to open its reluctant petals. I gave him the distilled version. He listened in silence, eyes fixed on the orchid, like it was pronouncing a theorem. "A confession," he said. "Heard and overheard." "Yes." He turned away from the flower and settled into his chair with the air of a man about to accuse a nation. That is the fulcrum. Not the act confessed, but the act of listening. Someone weaponized repentance. I nodded. Blackmail? Perhaps at first, but memory festers. Eventually it becomes motive. He reached for the beer I had placed earlier and took a measured sip. Someone turned the sacrament into currency, Archie. And now others are paying interest. I leaned forward. And the killer? He closed his eyes. The killer is the one who knows that confession, once heard, cannot be unheard. And with that, the orchid bloomed. I didn't notice him at first, not until I stepped off the church steps and crossed to the deli for a bitter cup of Bronx coffee. He was across the street beside a bus shelter that hadn't seen a schedule since Truman. Tall, narrow-shouldered, coat collar up against the wind. Claude Varin. I ducked inside the deli, took my coffee to go, and looped back around the block. He didn't move, but his eyes tracked. Wolfe doesn't like improvisation unless he's doing it with a truffle, but I followed instinct and strolled past him, slow. When I turned the corner, I doubled back, quiet as I could, and caught him watching the church door like it owed him money. When I stepped up behind him, I didn't get through the first word before he turned, and his hand came up with it, a pistole, not large, but not undecided. "Mr. Varin," I said evenly, "I was hoping we could have a civilized chat." He didn't lower it. "I saw her come here," he said. "The woman in the pew." "There was no woman?" His hand trembled. "You think I don't know?" "I think," I replied. "You're not sure who's watching whom." His lips pressed tight, then he turned and walked off fast. No panic, but purpose. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The way he gripped that pistol told me the next answer wouldn't come in words. I didn't get back to the brownstone until after 8. Wolfe had already dined and was on to his second glass of Moselle. I had just begun to report when the phone rang. It was Lon Cohen. Claude Varin's wine shop went up in flames. "How bad?" "Total loss. No one hurt. Shop was closed. Fire department's calling it arson, unofficially." I hung up and passed it to Wolfe in 4 words. He didn't look surprised. "An erasure," he said. "Of what?" "Not inventory. Claude wasn't selling wine. He was selling history, bottled, labelled, and disguised. Something in that cellar connected him to Merivale. Proof." "Gone now," he said flatly. "Fire is the last tool of the desperate and the first of the guilty." I stood by the window, watching the city blink against the dark. Wolfe set his glass down. "If Varin is not already gone," he said, "then he is waiting for the moment when disappearance feels like absolution." I turned back to him. "And if he's not guilty?" Wolfe's brow lifted. "Then he's terrified of someone who is." He closed the file with care. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Not rushing, not fleeing, just circling. Wolfe does not accept cases. He acquires them, like orchids or indigestion, grudgingly and only when no reasonable escape remains. For 3 days he had circled the matter of Elodie Varin with the same distaste he reserved for modern theatre and canned anchovies. Then, after breakfast, as I was filing away a particularly irritable note from Inspector Kramer, he spoke. "This is no longer parochial," he said. I looked up. "You mean it's grown teeth?" "I mean," he continued, "it has acquired depth." "European depth." "Oblique motives, long shadows." "So we're in." He gave me a baleful glance. "Do not vulgarize it. We are not in. We are compelled." I reached for the casebook. "You're accepting Elodie Varin as a client?" "I am recognizing," he said, "that her predicament intersects with interests too entrenched to ignore." "That's practically affectionate." He ignored that. "Send word. She may come tomorrow. I will hear her, without embroidery." "And if she embroiders?" He sighed. "Then I will unpick the thread, but delicately." I knew the tone. The case had ceased to be an irritation. It had become a challenge, and for Wolfe, that was as close to excitement as oxygen would allow. When Wolfe invites guests for dinner, it is not to entertain. It is to interrogate, politely, over duck à l'orange and manipulated seating arrangements. That evening, the dining room was dressed for war. At the head sat Wolfe, brooding behind a bottle of Beaune. To his left, Elodie Varin, quiet and composed. Opposite her, Claude Varin, his left hand, still bandaged from the wine shop fire, and his right hand twitching toward the breadbasket with too much interest in the butter. Inspector Kramer occupied the far end, chewing with hostility. And between Claude and Kramer, the late Merivale's literary executor, a man named Howard Embry, whose glasses fogged slightly every time the word Paris was mentioned. I hovered, not quite a guest and not quite a servant, taking mental notes with the precision of a tax auditor. Wolfe, who abhors small talk, opened with murder. "Mr. Embry," he said, "you were close to Merivale?" Embry swallowed nervously. "I handled his estate, his writings. We were not close, but I respected him." "Did you know Miss Forsyth?" "Only by reputation." "Then let us discuss reputation," Wolfe said. "Yours, Merivale's, and that of 1944, Paris." Silence clanged briefly against the silverware. "Much," Wolfe added, "is hidden in history's footnotes, and some of it is misfiled under Artforks paused. Claude drank water like it had secrets. It was not a dinner, it was a séance, and someone at the table was not telling the truth to the dead. Wolfe had barely touched his duck when it happened. Embry, trying to curry favour with either Wolfe or his own nerves, launched into an anecdote about Merivale's habit of dictating long-winded critiques of modernism. "He had a passion for precision," Embry said. "He recorded hours of commentary. Those tapes were—" He stopped, fork half raised, sweat starting near his collar. Kramer pounced first. "Tapes?" Embry blinked. "Yes, he recorded regularly. Dozens of reels. It was—" I cut in. "There's been no mention of tapes in the estate inventory." Embry's eyes flicked to Wolfe. "They may have been personal." Elodie, who until then had been silent, asked quietly, "Did one of those tapes mention me?" Claude's fork froze. Wolfe's eyes narrowed just slightly. Embry stammered, "I don't know. I only—" "You said hours," Wolfe said. "So you listened?" Embry hesitated. Wolfe's tone shifted, low and dangerous. "You listened." The executor shrank an inch. "Only enough to catalogue themes. Nothing. Detailed." "And you didn't think to report this?" Kramer snapped. "When a man turns up dead and someone writes Elodie in his blood?" Embry had no answer. But Wolfe did. His voice was cold as the plate. "Mr. Embry," he said, "you have just proven one thing." "What's that?" "That memory, when recorded, is rarely silent." After the table was cleared and the coffee arrived, strong, black, and thick enough to carry secrets, Wolfe produced a thin sheaf of paper. He tapped it once against the tablecloth like a priest about to read names of the damned. "This," he said, "is a list." "Of what?" Claude asked, his voice too casual. "Of those who departed Paris in 1944 with forged documentation and plausible destinations. People who had something to flee or something to hide." He passed it to Kramer, who scanned the names. "Merivale, Varin, Forsyth, and this fourth?" "A pseudonym," Wolfe said. "The name is fictitious. The person is not." Elodie leaned forward. "And you think one of them—" "I think," Wolfe replied, "that this quartet intersected in a moment of confession, either spoken or stolen, and ever since, one has been trying to silence the others." Claude's jaw tensed. "You're assuming guilt." "I am assuming motive," Wolfe said. "Guilt is your burden to clarify." Embry sat pale and motionless, as if praying Wolfe had lost interest in him. He hadn't. "There are times," Wolfe added, "when escape is not an act of survival, but an act of ambition. And ambition," he said, looking directly at Embry, "has long legs." The next morning, a small lockbox arrived by messenger from Merivale's solicitor, belated contents of the safe found beneath a false panel in the Gramercy studio. Inside was a brown leather diary, cracked at the spine and filled with neat rows of angular shorthand, peppered with dates, initials, and strange Latin phrases. Wolfe turned it over like it was a scorpion. His code is classical, pedestrian, but layered. He settled into his chair with the diary in hand, a snifter of brandy at his elbow, and a silence so profound even Fritz tiptoed in the kitchen. I waited 2 hours before interrupting. He didn't look up. "Archie, do you know the difference between a secret and a scandal? One's hidden, the other's hunted." "Precisely." He flipped another page. Merivale believed in cataloguing his enemies, but not linearly. He wrote as though preparing a court case. "And we're the jury?" "We are the archivists," Wolfe murmured. "And I intend to preserve every damnable syllable." Outside, a storm rattled the glass. Inside, the only sound was paper, turning like time. When he finally closed the book, the corners of his mouth curled, not with satisfaction, but with grim acknowledgement. He feared more than discovery, Archie. He feared remembrance. That evening, after dinner, Wolfe poured a second brandy, not for indulgence, but for punctuation. He opened the diary to a bookmarked page and began to read aloud, slowly, as if each sentence needed to be chewed. The confession remains intact, though time has inflated its value. Each year adds weight, not relief. She doesn't know I kept a copy. He paused. "She, I presume, is Miss Forsyth?" I nodded. Wolfe continued. "Claude is cautious, but not clean. He believes I burned it. Irene wants peace, but peace is only earned. Elodie forgets. I do not." He closed the diary and looked at me. "Do you see? Merivale kept it as leverage." "Yes, and as insurance. The confession was his currency." "Who confessed?" Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he said, "This was not a diary. It was a ledger, and the debt is coming due." I glanced at the clock. "So now what?" He leaned back. "Now we see who wishes to pay the balance, and who will kill to erase the account." There was no triumph in his voice, only the dry, deliberate weight of justice pulling at a frayed thread. The doorbell rang just before midnight. Kramer entered with damp shoulders and the expression of a man who has eaten something that didn't agree with him, like regret. "I have a body," he said. Wolfe, unamused, gestured toward the decanter. "So do I, Inspector. It's how we differ from ghosts." Kramer ignored that and tossed a file onto the table. "Paris, 1945. Body pulled from the Seine. No identification, no family, case closed as an accident." I picked up the file. The old photograph was grainy, but something in the jawline felt familiar. "Fingerprint finally ran through Interpol this week," Kramer added. "Matches a set taken from a suspect in Nice. Name used there was Gérard Lemoine." Wolfe's brow lifted. "The pseudonym from my list." "Bingo," Kramer said. "So now we have 4 names, 3 alive, 1 dead in the Seine. Elodie, Claude, Merivale," I counted, "and Lemoine." Kramer nodded. "Lemoine vanished after the war. Turns out he stayed vanished." Wolfe closed the folder. "This corpse," he said, "is not an end. It's a beginning." I watched him lean back, thoughtful. When Wolfe calls a long-dead body a beginning, it means someone still breathing has just become terribly inconvenient. If there's a smell to Midtown, it's old ink, coffee gone sour, and ambition. The shop on East 41st was narrow as a confession booth and quieter than most libraries dream of being. Sheldon Harbury, rare booksman and accidental collector of minor felonies, greeted me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd once had dealings with the IRS. "I'm looking for something specific," I said. "A parcel sold in the last 2 weeks. Reels, labelled Paris, 1944. He gave me the look booksellers reserve for people who use the word volume when they mean issue. "I don't deal in tapes." "No," I said, "but you deal in things people tuck inside books." He sniffed. They were inside a hollowed-out copy of the Charter House of Parma, first edition if you care. "I care," he sighed. "It was a private sale. Buyer left no name, paid cash. Very polite, very specific. Man or woman?" "Woman. Dark glasses, gloves in May. Said it was a family legacy." "That's one word for it." He frowned. "Is there a problem?" "Not yet, but you may want to check your returns policy." I left with the receipt copy. No name, no address. Just the distinct scent of someone trying to buy back history. It took a call to a cab company, a glance at a surveillance tape Wolfe never officially requested, and the polite application of a $10 bill to a doorman with a long memory. The buyer had been Irene Foresight. Just days before her overdose, she had entered Harbury's shop under the kind of disguise favoured by women who'd been famous and were trying to forget it. She had paid in cash, refused a bag, and walked out with a first edition concealing a truth wrapped in magnetic tape. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the facts. She bought them, I said, not to listen, to hide. Wolfe didn't answer. But someone sent her. That made him look up. Precisely. He stared out the window as if the orchids had changed colour. She had no reason, he said quietly. Which means someone else did. And that someone, I knew, was still breathing. Wolfe did not raise his voice, which meant he was thinking clearly and likely about murder. Not to commit, but to understand. She bought them, he said. Not to hear them, to silence them. And died for it. Not quite, Wolfe corrected. She died because the one who sent her knew she had limits, sentiment, conscience. He took a deep breath, not for effect, but for equilibrium. She was meant to destroy the tapes, and perhaps she did. But she hesitated. That hesitation cost her. I leaned back. So we're looking for someone who trusted her just enough. No, Wolfe said. We are looking for someone who understood that trust is expendable. He turned to the casebook and tapped Merivale's name, then Varins, then Irene's. All dead or vanished, except one. Embry? Wolfe shook his head. Number, he lacks subtlety. He looked at me. This person directed Irene, knew the shop, knew the artifact, which means they also knew the contents. That narrows it. Yes, Wolfe said grimly. To someone who never needed the tapes to know what was on them. And suddenly, the question wasn't who heard the confession, it was who remembered it best. Wolfe's method of elimination wasn't procedural, it was surgical. Merivale, he said, is dead. He orchestrated, he preserved, but he no longer plays. Claude? Hiding, possibly armed, but not calculated. He lacks the poise for manipulation on this scale. Elodie? She is guilty of a single act, not a scheme. Her fear is genuine, and her confusion unfeigned. I folded my arms. So who's left? He steepled his fingers. Embry is ambitious, opportunistic, and increasingly rattled, but he is a scavenger, not a tactician. He exploits weakness. He does not engineer it. I watched him carefully. So we're missing someone? No, Wolfe said, eyes narrowing. We are looking too closely at the immediate circle. We must widen the frame. To who? He reached for the folder of names, the Paris exiles, the forged identities, the survivors. There is someone, he said, whose name we have not yet recognized. And yet? And yet they are in every room. That's when I knew Wolfe had felt the shape of the puzzle beneath the surface. But he wasn't ready to lift it just yet, not until it rattled in someone else's hands. She came as requested, though her face bore the erosion of sleepless nights and the subtle tremble of someone no longer outrunning her own past. Wolfe remained seated, of course, but his posture was more vertical than usual, a courtesy, or perhaps a signal, that what followed would not be interrogation, but ritual. Elodie, he said, you must tell me. Her voice was brittle. Tell you what? What happened in Paris, and what you did? She looked at me, then at Wolfe, and for a moment I thought she might bolt, but instead she straightened, the way a soldier might before the tribunal. It was a Thursday, October 12th, 1944. The Germans had retreated, but the air was still dangerous. My brother Jacques, he was 16, had been hiding. A man came to our flat. He wore civilian clothes but spoke with the authority of command. He said he was with the collaborationist police. He knew Jacques' name. She paused, her breath caught, not for effect. I offered him money. He refused. He smiled. I went to the kitchen and fetched my father's revolver. I didn't hesitate. I fired twice. Wolfe inclined his head. And the confession? A priest, later that night. I don't remember where. I was drunk. I was undone. Wolfe nodded once, gently. You confessed to save your soul. Someone else remembered it to stain theirs. She closed her eyes. I have lived with it, she said, but someone else made it live again. Wolfe said nothing. He didn't have to. After she left, Wolfe turned to me with the expression of a man who has found the rot beneath the wallpaper and intends to burn the house down. She confessed, as expected, but not to murder. You heard her? Yes, and she killed, but what she described was not a crime, it was clarity. I nodded. So someone else heard it and turned it into capital. Wolfe folded his hands. That is the essence. Someone overheard her confession, in Paris or soon after. And from that moment, it ceased to be an act of atonement and became a lever. He looked toward the orchids, which were blooming in a way that made the moment seem almost unkind. Do you understand the enormity, Archie? I think so. Number you don't. His voice was low. To use a confession to manipulate, to extort, to kill, requires not just malice, but intimacy. It means the perpetrator does not fear guilt, only exposure. He picked up the prayer book from the desk and turned a page without reading. Truth is not the crime here, memory is, and someone has made it lethal. He stood, a rare event, and walked 3 steps before stopping. It was almost enough to make me uneasy. Almost. Wolfe summoned her back before sundown. She returned, face pale but dry, posture like a statue, one that had been chipped at the edges. He didn't stand, but he did incline his head. Elodie, he said, you killed once. But the rest, Merivale, Forsyth, the threats, you did not commit them. She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand. You believe you set this in motion, but that is a fallacy. You buried your act in confession. Someone else dug it up and wielded it. Tears came, quiet and quick, but she didn't argue. Wolfe continued softly. You are not absolved by me. I am no priest, but you are not the architect of this misery. She nodded once, as if the words gave structure to something she had only ever carried. When she left, Wolfe sat very still for a long while. It was, I thought, as close to mercy as he ever allowed himself. I was writing up the day's notes, and Wolfe was pretending not to reread the coded diary when the doorbell rang. Not the usual hesitant press of a client, a sharp, urgent knock, like someone who needed something and feared they were already too late. I went to answer, and Wolfe didn't ask who it was. The figure on the stoop was tall, wrapped in a dark coat, one hand buried in the folds with the tension of concealment. The eyes were wide, darting, the breath shallow, visible. I didn't need to ask what brought them. It had arrived. Trouble, not knocking anymore, waiting. And inside, Wolfe lifted his head, not in surprise, but with the grave certainty of a man who had long expected the past to arrive with poor manners and a concealed weapon. I opened the door. The next page was already writing itself. I've developed an instinct for the kind of knock that carries intent. This one had it, a too confident rap that tried to sound casual and failed. I opened the door with my best poker face and found myself face to face with Theodore Embry, literary executor by title, opportunist by temperament. His expression bore the sheen of polite tension, the kind that doesn't survive long under Wolfe's scrutiny. I hope I'm not intruding, he said, a gloved hand fussing with his collar. The other stayed too close to his coat's inner lining for my taste. That depends. You carrying goodwill or just paperwork? His smile flickered like a fluorescent bulb. There's been confusion. I'd like to clarify it with Mr. Wolfe, if possible. I let him in. He moved with caution, his eyes flitting over the entryway like a man memorizing blueprints. No bulge, but something about that coat pocket nagged at me. Wolfe had taught me to trust my nerves. They were ringing like dinner bells in a hailstorm. As I closed the door behind him, I mentally rearranged the seating plan. Courtesy on the outside, insurance underneath. Trouble had arrived with a silk tie and literary credentials. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He inclined his head no more than a quarter-inch, his version of a red carpet, and gestured toward the red armchair, which Embry took with a twitch of hesitation. "Mr. Embry," Wolfe said, "you are welcome. I assume you're not armed. I would prefer not to be contradicted." Embry's eyebrows lifted a hair. "Of course not." "Good. Beer, Mr. Goodwin." "Fritz's or imported?" "Domestic. We are cultivating simplicity." I brought two. Wolfe didn't touch his. Embry took one sip and set his bottle on the table like it might explode. "I understand you wish to clarify something," Wolfe prompted, folding his hands. "I do," Embry said too quickly. "There's been a great deal of speculation regarding Irene Forsyth's intentions. I thought some confusion could be alleviated." "Indeed. Confusion, Mr. Embry, is like yeast. It rises best in a warm room." Wolfe leaned back. "Do proceed." Wolfe rarely opened with biography, but when he did, it was never out of kindness. "You were born in Paris, Mr. Embry, a wartime orphan, evacuated from the 10th arrondissement after the bombings of 43. Embry blinked. "I'm surprised you know that." "I'm always surprised by what others find surprising," Wolfe replied. "Your file was economical, raised in the custody of Merivale's great-aunt, educated at St. Albans, fluency in French, Latin, and dissimulation." Embry's knuckles paled against the beer bottle. "I mean no insult," Wolfe said mildly. "To survive in wartime Paris was to inhale secrecy as oxygen. You grew up among whispers and omissions. It is not unreasonable to assume you heard more than you were meant to." Embry's voice lost its polish. "That was a long time ago." "Time is not a solvent. Some stains set forever." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Let me be plain. You know precisely what Irene Forsyth died for, because you brokered the very currency that killed her." Embry looked to me, as if hoping for a softer face. I gave him neutrality. "I thought this was a clarification," he said. "It is," Wolfe replied. "And like all true clarifications, it begins with truth, not pretense." Wolfe tapped his forefinger against his lips, a sign, in my experience, that he was about to draw blood with words. "Merivale offered you protection," he said quietly. "But he extracted a price, loyalty, silence, and occasionally complicity. It was never guardianship, Mr. Embry. It was insurance." Embry flinched. The word hit home. His pupils contracted like a man swallowing something sharp. "You were the child in the corner, the one no one noticed, and yet you heard everything. Irene Forsyth, naive or brave, I don't presume to judge, tried to disrupt the arrangement. She unearthed something and threatened to speak." Wolfe paused, as if savouring the next sentence. "She died alone, efficiently, in silence." Embry's jaw worked but produced nothing. "I ask no confession," Wolfe added. "But know this, I do not mistake quiet for innocence." "I was a child," Embry said. "You were a child," Wolfe agreed, "and then a man who remembered too much and used it." There was a pause, thick enough to ladle. I noticed Embry's hand had migrated near that infamous coat pocket again, noted and filed. Wolfe didn't lean forward. He didn't have to. "There are debts," he murmured, "that compound across decades." Wolfe shifted slightly, which for him was the equivalent of a courtroom gavel. "You saw the photograph," he said. "The one torn deliberately, one figure removed." Embry didn't answer, so Wolfe continued. 4 people stood in that frame: Irene, Claude, Merivale, and the boy who wasn't supposed to exist. Silence held until Wolfe's voice turned just faintly pitying. "The tape labelled Paris, 1944. You had it brokered through Irene. She bought it days before her death. Not for herself, of course, but for you. She thought she was helping." Embry stared at the fireplace, glassy-eyed. "You whispered to her about a confession, and she acted. She always did like moral causes. Terribly impractical woman." Wolfe's voice sharpened. "And then she died, followed by Merivale, followed by attempted threats against Elodie Varin." Embry tried to find footing. "That's conjecture." "No," Wolfe said. "It's pattern." He leaned forward at last, slow and deliberate. Each thread loops through a single hand, the one person who stood on the margins of the war, the deaths and the silence. The executor, the boy in the photograph, the forgotten orphan who never forgot. Embry's voice cracked. "They used me." Wolfe inclined his head. "They did. But it was you who turned memory into leverage, and leverage into murder." I noticed then that his coat pockets sagged slightly. Weight, not fabric. I shifted my stance. Wolfe's eyes flicked once to mine. The net had been drawn. Desperation's last refuge is misdirection, and Embry grabbed it like a drowning man. "Claude Varin," he said suddenly. "He was always violent. He had motive. He ran. Doesn't that tell you anything?" Wolfe sighed. "Yes, it tells me you're resorting to distraction." "He burned his own wine shop." "Someone burned it," Wolfe replied. "And he fled because he feared someone who had just killed 2 people with precision, not wine and wrath." Embry's voice pitched up. "Then why did Claude disappear the night of Irene's death?" Wolfe lifted a small notebook, mine, I noted, and read with detachment. "Claude Varin boarded a northbound train at 8:11 p.m., confirmed by the conductor. Irene was found at 9:40. That train was 117 miles north by then. Even a murderer needs proximity." Embry opened his mouth, shut it. "And the fire at the wine shop?" Wolfe continued. "Time to coincide with your library visit. Insurance fraud doesn't smell like guilt. It smells like fear." He tapped the arm of his chair once, crisply. "No, Mr. Embry. Claude was imperfect, but his sins were amateur. Yours are curated." Embry looked for a window, found only walls. "There was no confession of murder," Wolfe said softly. "Not as you wielded it." Embry said nothing. His fingers dug into the armrest like claws. "The original confession," Wolfe continued, "was one of mercy. A young woman, alone in occupied Paris, delivered a mortal wound to a man already bleeding, already doomed, to spare him Gestapo torture. She confessed it in grief, not guilt." He paused. "That voice on the tape, the one Irene purchased, wasn't leverage, it was lament." I watched Embry's face shrink inward. The armor was folding. "You took that act," Wolfe said, "and shaped it into legend. You let it grow, unchallenged. You whispered it into Merivale's ear, then Irene's. And when they no longer served its purpose..." He let the implication sit. "I never," Embry croaked. "No," Wolfe agreed. "You didn't kill in the alleys of Paris. You waited. You let truth decay into currency." His voice dropped further. "Your greatest crime wasn't the murder of bodies. It was the murder of memory." Embry's eyes had lost focus. Whatever he had counted on, bluff, ambiguity, Wolfe's supposed apathy, it had crumbled. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "A confession is a sacred thing, Mr. Embry, until someone makes it a weapon." Kramer entered 10 minutes later, trench coat flapping like a sail in foul wind. He took one look at Embry, then me. "Is this the part where you tell me he confessed?" "Nope," I said. "But I'd check his coat, left pocket. You might find the motive, the means, and your probable cause, neatly arranged." Embry didn't move. He was studying the rug. Kramer retrieved the revolver without comment, then the tapes, then the crumpled photo. "You'll need a tight case," Embry muttered. "I like tight," Kramer said, "especially when it snaps shut." Wolfe stirred just enough to speak. "Justice is rarely poetic," he said. "But in this case I'll allow myself a moment." Kramer didn't smile, but he didn't argue either. As they led Embry out, Wolfe reached for his glass, untouched until then. He didn't drink, just held it. The silence that followed wasn't peace, but it was close enough to count. Wolfe's appetite had never required encouragement, but that evening it approached ceremony. Fritz's cassoulet, simmered 6 hours, layered with duck confit, sausage, and a discreet but insistent garlic, received from Wolfe the sort of reverent silence usually reserved for funerals and first editions. I let him finish uninterrupted, When the final morsel had vanished and he had dabbed his lips with the monogrammed linen, he leaned back in his chair like a general surveying a conquered map. "Mr. Goodwin," he murmured, "confession is the last bastion of the desperate. It is not the truth that liberates, but the hope that someone will accept it as such." I had my elbows on the table. "You're saying Embry never hoped for anything?" Wolfe gave a small shrug. "He confessed nothing. He permitted others to believe a different theology entirely. Still makes him a killer." "Undoubtedly. But guilt, as any philosopher will tell you, is not always synchronous with action. Some guilt precedes the crime, some survives it." I left that hanging. It was Wolfe's way of writing the epilogue, not for the case, but for the soul behind it. He reached for the small salt cellar, not to use it, just to realign it by 1/2 inch. And then he said no more. The morning mail came in a stack, 2 bills, 1 pamphlet on root rot in orchids, and a cream envelope bearing the black ink stamp of the French consulate. Wolfe didn't move a muscle, so I slit it open with my thumbnail. It was from Father Leclerc. The handwriting was careful and grave. The letter contained only 1 sentence, written in a style that gave away more than it admitted. "Some truths must be lived, not spoken." I read it aloud. Wolfe closed his eyes, as if evaluating the rhythm of the phrase, then gave a single nod. "He will remain silent," Wolfe said. "Is that resignation or strategy?" "Neither. It is monastic pragmatism. The man believes in atonement by presence. And we believe in courtrooms. That is why we dine better," Wolfe replied, "but understand less." I filed the letter in the correspondence folder and made a note to send a brief reply. Nothing elaborate, just a line or 2. There are those, I've learned, who carry truth like a lantern through fog. And then there are those who strike matches only when the wind permits. Father Leclerc had chosen the former. Wolfe, as ever, respected the efficiency of a man who kept his silences symmetrical. Claude and Elodie Varin didn't make a speech or a scene. They left quietly, like smoke from a candle. Claude took the battered valise. Elodie wore a scarf too heavy for the season. They paused only long enough in the foyer to sign a document Wolfe had prepared, a notarized statement for the police, absolving Claude of complicity. Wolfe didn't ask them to linger. Claude shook my hand, eyes wary but dry. "It's over," he said. Elodie said nothing at all, but her grip was firmer than I'd expected, not forgiving, not trembling, just final. They had sold the remains of the wine shop to a cousin in Montclair and had booked a train north, not back to France, just somewhere quieter, somewhere with fewer doorbells. Wolfe, watching from his chair, had only 1 comment after they were gone. "A marriage scarred by war," he said, "is not always a marriage undone, but neither is it the same union." I jotted that one down. People think resolution means repair. Sometimes it's just a line drawn under damage too old to heal and too fresh to forget. Their cab turned the corner. And with that, the house settled into a stillness not empty, but measured. There are expressions Wolfe doesn't waste: surprise, compassion, sentiment. They clutter the face and dilute the argument. But I've learned to read the nuance behind his scowls and scorn. That day, Elodie Varin confessed. Back in chapter 6, if you're keeping track, Wolfe did something I've seen him do exactly once. He looked at her, then looked again. Not with appraisal or doubt, with something else. Something like recognition. After she left, I asked him why. He said nothing for 10 seconds, a rare silence, which with Wolfe meant turbulence under the surface. Then, "A killer, yes, but not a criminal." I filed that one next to the rare wines. He never clarified what he meant, but I have a guess. Elodie had killed once, not to gain but to preserve, and then she had lived, really lived, with the weight of it. She hadn't polished it into legend or hidden it behind others. She had just worn it, like frost in the marrow, and Wolfe, for all his cerebral disdain for passion and chaos, had recognized it as something bordering nobility. I never brought it up again, Some expressions and some people only need to be seen once. The only thing rarer than a full apology from Inspector Kramer is a bottle of wine older than Wolfe's orchids. That evening, we got both. Kramer showed up with his usual nasal growl and a bottle of Chateau Latour, 39, under his arm. Dusty label, cork intact, the kind of gesture that cost pride, not just money. "I came to return the favour," he said, and set it down like it weighed more than Embry's motives. Wolfe raised an eyebrow, not both, just one. That was his equivalent of shock. "A commendable year," he noted. "Also a difficult one." Kramer huffed. "We've all had those." He stayed standing. The bottle stayed sealed. "I misjudged," he said at last. "The lady, the timeline, the tapes." "You often do," Wolfe murmured. "And you often gloat." "I do," Wolfe agreed. "But not when I'm offered something better." I fetched the corkscrew, but Wolfe made no move. He stared at the wine as if reading a dossier. Kramer didn't press it. He never does when the stakes are emotional. He just nodded once, grunted again, and left the bottle on the table. "Thank you," he said at the door. "Grudging sincerity," Wolfe murmured. "The finest vintage." After Kramer left, I reached for the cork. Wolfe's gaze stopped me mid-stretch. "No," he said, with a finality that didn't require elaboration. I gave him a look. "Not even for closure?" "I do not toast ghosts, Mr. Goodwin." I withdrew my hand. Wolfe doesn't trade in sentimentality. If he refuses a glass, it's not from restraint, it's from judgment. Still, I poured myself half an inch. Someone ought to mark the end of a war that hadn't known it was still being fought. "Suit yourself," I said, lifting the glass. Wolfe didn't reply. He stared out the window, which offered nothing but brick and iron railing. His fingers tapped once on the arm of his chair, and then were still. The cassoulet was gone, the files were closed, the past had been hauled, piece by piece, from dusty shelves to polished speech. And yet something in Wolfe's posture suggested that not everything had been put away. I didn't ask, I drank alone. The wine was deep, dry, and left a trace of something bitter behind the finish, not unpleasant, just honest. Wolfe didn't move again until I turned out the light. Some silences, even in this house, weren't meant to be shared. The casebook was open on my desk. I'd updated the last entry, signed my initials, and drawn the final double line under the closing statement. Wolfe had retired to the orchid rooms. Fritz was polishing the silver. Outside, the city was doing its usual imitation of insomnia. I sat there a minute longer, pen in hand, looking at the neat rows of type and the occasional ink blot that marked where something unexpected had happened. Case's end, sure, but not always clean. There was no jury for Embry, no applause for Elodie, no monument for Irene Foresight. There was just the truth, half spoken, half endured, and the lives that went on carrying it. I closed the casebook with a soft click. Not every confession ends in peace, but some, at least, end in silence. The case is closed, the wine uncorked, and the ghosts, those persistent, whispering echoes from a war-torn Paris, have found, if not absolution, at least a kind of stillness. Elodie walks away with her truth intact, if not unscarred. Wolfe returns to his orchids, and I to my typewriter, both of us knowing that some confessions are not meant to absolve, only to endure. But tell me, do you believe a secret kept in silence can ever truly be forgiven? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.